Every summer, people in the United States celebrate a holiday that has now come to be known only as the 4th of July. This is a day for barbecues, fireworks, sales, and dressing up in red, white, and blue. But Americans rarely think about the reason we get a day off from work each year. So, I decided I would try to do something to remind people that the original name of the holiday was Independence Day, and that it was intended to be a day when we celebrate the Declaration of Independence and the founding of our democratic government. I'm not going to begin by reading the Declaration of Independence because, as Nicolas Cage so eloquently says in National Treasure, people don't talk like that anymore. It's fairly pointless to read the document unless you understand what the words mean. And in order to understand what the words mean, you need to understand U.S. history and the philosophy of the framers of the Declaration of Independence. That said, who were the actual framers of the document? Well, on June 11, 1776, the Second Continental Congress established a committee of 5 to prepare a statement of the reasons why the British colonies in America wanted to leave their motherland and form their own country. The committee consisted of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Because they left no minutes from their meetings, we are uncertain as to what actually happened in that committee. Accounts that were written in the 1790s by Adams and Jefferson are unreliable because by that time the two men had become political rivals. Adams and his supporters became the Federalist Party. Jefferson and his followers called themselves the Democratic Republicans. Consequently, both sides reimagined what happened that summer in Philadelphia to further their political goals. They both told the story in such a way as to make their contribution seem more important. Jefferson and his followers boasted about his authorship. Adams' supporters touted his stewardship. What is certain is that the committee originally thought that Adams should write the document, but Adams persuaded them to choose Jefferson with the expressed promise that Adams would actively consult with Jefferson. After the committee discussed the general outline that the document should follow, Jefferson wrote the first draft. The committee then presented this draft to Congress on June 28, 1776, and Congress debated for 7 days until they agreed upon a final version. Okay, that's who wrote the document. Now, what does it mean? To properly understand what the framers were thinking when they wrote the Declaration, you must understand that the framers lived in a period known as the Age of Enlightenment. This was a time in history when certain people in Europe were wealthy and educated enough that they could be philosophers. These philosophers considered such lofty ideas as, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And if you hold an apple in your hand and you can only see one side, how do you know the other side is there? And, my favorite, how many fairies can you fit on the head of a pin? One of the many great questions that the Enlightenment philosophers studied is a question we are still asking ourselves today. Why do people establish governments? To understand why people created governments, the Enlightenment thinkers realized that they first needed to understand the very nature of mankind. What was the essence, the basic core of humanity? What would motivate people to do this? To understand what mankind was like, these philosophers decided that they needed to strip everything away, to remove all artificial constructs, and to put man in a state of nature. What would people be like in a world without rules and laws and possessions? One of the first Europeans to publish a work on this topic was Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes looked around at the people he knew, and he thought, in a state of nature, without any rules and laws and possessions, mankind is equal. Here's what he said. Nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind, that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable as that one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit to which another may not pretend as well as he. Okay, so if we were to put Hobbes's words into modern language, what Hobbes is saying is that everyone is special. We all have different gifts and talents, and that makes us all equal in the end. One person might be really strong, but another is really smart or a really fast runner or very popular. So, if the strong person tries to beat the others up, the smart person will outwit him, the fast person will run away, and the popular person will get her friends to protect her. So in the end, they're all equal. But for Hobbes, equality was a problem because it was going to cause people to fight with each other. Hobbes wrote that there were going to be 3 causes of quarrel: competition, diffidence, and glory. The first, he said, maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation. The first use violence to make themselves masters over other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle, the second to defend them, the third for trifles. Consequently, the state of nature very quickly became a state of war, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So why do we create governments? We create them, Hobbes said, to protect our lives, to make us safe. So, what type of government should we have? Who should be allowed to make the rules? Who should be given lawmaking power? Well, you can have no one making the rules. That's anarchy. And Hobbes said anarchy leads to fighting and chaos. Or you can have one person making the rules. If that person inherits power, we call it monarchy. If the person gets power through force or an election, we call it dictatorship. Or you can allow a group of people to make the rules. If they inherit rule-making power, we call it an oligarchy. If they get their power through force or elections, we call it totalitarianism. Finally, you can let everyone make the rules, and that's democracy. If everyone votes for every law, it's a direct democracy. But if people select representatives to make the laws for them, we call it appropriately representative democracy. Hobbes looked at all these choices and argued that monarchy was the best way to protect lives because you knew who your ruler was and that ruler's word was final. You got swift and decisive action and had a clear succession plan. A few years later, John Locke came on the scene. He looked around and imagined man in a state of nature, and do you know what he concluded? He concluded that, in a state of nature, man was equal. Locke said, to understand political power aright, we must consider what a state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of equality, where all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank should all be equal one amongst another. Sounds a lot like Hobbes. But Locke did not envision this equality the same way that Hobbes did. Locke did not view people as greedy, scared, and vain. Rather, he saw people as reasonable beings, generally inclined toward peace and prosperity. He said, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." In other words, all men are created equal. We all have a right to life, liberty, and property. And rational people will naturally respect each other's rights. The problem was, however, that rights overlap. For example, I have the right to throw punches. Other people have the right not to be hit. I have the right to sing, but you also have the right not to hear the awful noise that I would make if I sang. So even though we're all nice, rational people, we need rules to prevent us from unwittingly violating someone else's right. So we need a government to protect all of our rights. Okay, what kind of government best protects everyone's rights? Locke said, democracy. The next important European philosopher to mention is Rousseau. Building on the work that Hobbes and Locke had done, Rousseau wondered, once man decides that he needs a government, and he decides what type of government he wants, what makes that government legitimate? We know that we need rules and laws, but where does a government's authority to create these rules come from? His answer was that authority came from the people. No matter what type of government, monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, the people had to sanction it. As long as the people consented, the government was legitimate. In other words, people had to make a contract with the rulers, written or unwritten. Rousseau called this the social contract. A contract is an agreement between two parties where both sides give something up, but both sides get something in return. In this case, the people would be giving up their ultimate right to rule themselves and have all the freedom in the world, but they would be getting protection of their most important rights. For example, we have the right to free speech, to say anything we please, but we give up our right to yell fire in a crowded movie theater because that would cause panic and possibly loss of life. We all have the right to bear arms, but we give up our right to build nuclear bombs in our basement in order to prevent nuclear accidents or worse. That's what the people give up and get when they create a government. On the other side of the contract, the government would give up time, energy, ideas, but they would get power, decision-making, rule-making, power. Because both sides would agree to the contract, it would be legitimate and binding. But contracts are only legitimate and binding as long as each side follows the terms of the agreement. If I contract with you to mow my lawn for $100 and you mow my lawn, I owe you $100. I cannot pay you less, and you cannot insist that I pay you more. And, of course, if you don't mow my lawn, I don't owe you a cent. We both need to keep up our end of the bargain. In the case of the social contract, if a person breaks the contract by breaking a law that the government makes, then they are punished and lose more of their rights, like being fined or jailed. If the government breaks the contract by becoming corrupt and tyrannical, then the people either get new rulers or they create a whole new government. This same manner of philosophical study was also applied by the Enlightenment thinkers to economics. We don't have time to talk about all the important economists of the Enlightenment, but we do need to talk about the different economic systems that exist. Just as there are different political systems to choose from, there are also different economic systems to choose from when you're creating a government, depending on who has decision-making power over production and trade. When small family groups or clans are allowed to decide, it's a traditional system. When the government decides, it's called a command system. And when individuals decide for themselves, we call it a market economy. It's important to note that all of the political and economic systems I have mentioned are abstract concepts. In practice, they have all been modified. No country in the world has ever used any of these systems in their pure forms. So, going back to 1776, what type of political system did we have in America? Well, King George III of England was the ruler, but he shared his lawmaking authority with Parliament. We call that a constitutional monarchy. What type of economic system? It was a hybrid command and market system called mercantilism. Mercantilism was the idea that the colonies existed for the benefit of the mother country, and that she gets to make most of the economic decisions. What was wrong with these two systems? Why did the colonies revolt against it and want independence? Politically, they weren't worried about loss of life. They were worried about loss of liberty. They didn't like constitutional monarchy because they thought it was taking away too many of their rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, rights of the accused. They wanted a democracy to better protect their rights. Economically, they didn't like mercantilism. They didn't want to exist for the benefit of England. They wanted to exist for their own benefit. They hated all of the taxes and trade restrictions. Because many of the colonists did not like these political and economic systems, they began resisting. In Boston, Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty began practicing civil disobedience that turned into uncivil disobedience, with such activities as tarring and feathering, and the Boston Tea Party in December 1773. Committees of correspondence were set up to disseminate information throughout the colonies about all of the horrible things that England was doing. As the situation worsened, the First Continental Congress met in September and October of 1774. 6 months later, there was fighting in Lexington and Concord, so we called for a Second Continental Congress. It began meeting in Philadelphia in May 1775. On June 17, 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred, and 2 days later, on June 19, 1775, the Second Continental Congress commissioned George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Please keep in mind that all of these events occurred before Congress officially agreed to declare independence. It was going to take another year of fighting before Congress decided that there was no turning back and the U.S. needed to be rid of England. To repeat, fighting already existed. We had a standing army for over a year before the Declaration of Independence was written. Consequently, this document was not intended to be a recruiting tool. It was not intended to make men want to fight, and when you look at the words, you will see that they are beautiful and poetic, but they are not incendiary. So, what words did make people want to fight? What would be worth risking your life for? You were probably taught in school that the main rallying cry for the American Revolution was, "No taxation without representation." Can you imagine being whipped up into a frenzy and ready to revolt and fight and kill over this slogan? These were not the words that made men want to risk their lives and suffer hardships like Valley Forge. No. The authors whose words were most responsible for getting American men throughout the colonies to join up and fight was not Thomas Jefferson. It was another Thomas, Thomas Paine. Paine was an extremely interesting man who no one talks about anymore, so I'm going to take a minute to give you some information about him. Thomas Paine was born in England to a humble Quaker family. His father instilled in him a strong hatred for slavery, and he spoke out publicly against the institution. At 13, he left school to apprentice in his father's trade of corset making, which were ladies' undergarments, not exactly a highbrow profession. After a number of unsuccessful jobs, he moved to America in 1774 to teach at a girls' school in Philadelphia. Paine was so outraged at the way that England was treating her colonies that he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. In a country of only 2.4 million people, 500,000 copies were sold. As its title suggests, it made common sense arguments as to why a tiny island should not rule an entire continent. It includes the memorable and oft-quoted phrase, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, in its worst state, an intolerable one." Paine wrote several other important pamphlets during the American Revolution, including The American Crisis, "These are the times that try men's souls." After the American Revolution, Paine went to France to aid in their revolution. By the time he returned to America in 1801, he'd been forgotten. He died in 1809. Only 6 people attended his funeral. Here are some of Paine's words that moved a nation to war. "But Britain is the parent country, some say. Then the more shame upon her conduct. Even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their families. Everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'Tis time to part. Even the distance at which the Almighty hath placed England and America is a strong and natural proof that the authority of the one over the other was never the design of heaven. But if you say you can still pass the violations over, then I ask, hath your house been burnt? Hath your property been destroyed before your face? Are your wife and children destitute of a bed to lie on or bread to live on? Have you lost a parent or a child by their hands, and yourself the ruined and wretched survivor? If you have not, then you are not a judge of those who have. But if you have, and can still shake hands with the murderers, then you are unworthy the name of husband, father, friend, or lover, and whatever may be your rank or title in life, you have the heart of a coward and the spirit of a sycophant. Now them's fightin' words. By contrast, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, was born in Virginia, near Charlottesville. He was American aristocracy. His father was a wealthy planter, his mother an heiress. He was educated by private tutors. At 16, he entered the College of William Mary and studied mathematics, metaphysics, and philosophy. He spoke several languages and read 8. At 19, he studied law. At 21, he inherited 5,000 acres of land, including his future home site, Monticello. He inherited slaves and owned slaves his entire life. The picture on the left is what Jefferson looked like when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson returned from France later in 1789, he decided to reinvent his look and make himself look more American rather than European. The Declaration, as I said, was not written to get people excited to fight. It was a political document that was sent to the English king and Parliament, and it is written in the language of the Enlightenment philosophers. It sounds a lot like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and nothing at all like Paine. Here's what the preamble says. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Okay, let's put that in modern language. If we were to write this today in only 140 characters or less, we would say, if you're gonna break up with someone, the decent thing to do is tell them why. I used to teach this to high school students. They understood exactly what Jefferson was saying here. After all, there's nothing worse than when your boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you and doesn't tell you why. You agonize over it. Was it something I said? Was it something I did or didn't do? You have no closure. If the person tells you why, then you can get over them. I broke up with you because I don't like your friends. Well, I don't like yours either, so there. But without a reason, it's torture. So what Jefferson is saying is, England, we're breaking up with you. And because we're decent people, we're going to tell you why. Here's why. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Putting that into modern language, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Essentially, that's like saying, duh, it's self-evident, obvious. Duh. What's self-evident? That everyone is equal, and that we all have God-given rights. What are these rights? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds a lot like Locke, right? Almost word for word. He changed property to pursuit of happiness in order to sound less materialistic, but don't try that in your writing. You will definitely get in trouble for plagiarism. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. To protect our rights, we create governments. deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And what makes the government legit is that we agree to follow their rules. This is Rousseau, social contract. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Whenever a government doesn't protect your rights, people have the right to change the government or get a new one, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, and to create a new government that will protect rights. Again, this is straight up Rousseau, the social contract. Government violates your rights, you can change it or create a new one that will protect your rights. And the rest of the Declaration of Independence is a list of all the ways that the government of England, as presided over by King George, had taken away the colonists' rights. 27 complaints. Here are some of the things King George had done: quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, imposing taxes on us without our consent, depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. And then Jefferson sums it all up and declares the colonies free. And that's essentially what the Declaration says. To recap, preamble. If you're going to break up with someone, the decent thing to do is tell them why. Body. Duh. Everyone's equal and we all have rights. Governments are supposed to protect rights. When they don't, you can get a new government. Conclusion. England, you've taken away our rights. We're going to get a new government. See ya. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please click like and share it with your friends. Thank you very much.